The door slammed open before I could even react. A woman barged in, clipboard raised, eyes blazing with authority. "You're being evicted from this property immediately," she barked.
You get the
HOA
rain
regulations
today.
clearly state this cabin cannot be occupied under your name.
I wonder
I
what
froze.
gets
This was
more
my family
rain,
cabin,
the
decades of memories,
Netherlands
inherited from my grandfather, and now a
or
stranger
what
was claiming I
city
had
are
no
you
right to be
again?
here.
I
Two
can't
security guards
remember
stepped
if you
forward,
said, did
snapping
you?
photos of the porch, the furniture,
But let's
even
just
my trunk,
say
as if
Amsterdam,
documenting
for
a crime scene.
example. What
The
gets
woman,
more
Karen
rain,
Whitmore, the
Amsterdam
new
or
HOA
London?
president, smiled with an arrogance that made my blood boil. "We have all the legal authority," she said, "and we won't hesitate to enforce it." I took a deep breath. How could she think she could evict me from the land I legally own?
I think
And more
it's probably
importantly,
Amsterdam.
what was I going to do next? I've lived in this cabin my whole life, or at least as long as I can remember. It wasn't just a place to stay, it was home, a piece of my family's history carved into the mountainside. My grandfather helped finance this land decades ago. Long before most of the cabins were built, he made sure some parcels stayed in the family under long-term ground leases, and somehow I inherited them all. The mornings here were always quiet. Mist hovered over the lake, sunlight breaking through the pines, and the only sounds were birds, wind, and the occasional splash from someone fishing nearby. I spent years restoring the cabin, keeping it as my grandfather had intended. Simple, sturdy, and untouched by the chaos of the world outside. Life was peaceful. Neighbors waved as they walked their dogs. Community life was easy and predictable. I never imagined that all this could be challenged by a few pieces of paper and someone with too much confidence. I'd heard rumors about the new HOA president, Karen
You
Whitmore,
like
but I never
traveling
thought
till
she'd
you
come for
start
me.
getting slower.
Now, standing on my porch that morning, I realized that my
Yeah.
peaceful life was about to be anything but. Karen Whitmore didn't wait for pleasantries.
That's why
She stepped onto the porch like she owned the place,
do
which,
it.
of
It's
course,
just
she
like
thought she
number
did.
go up,
Her heels clicked
feel
against the wood
good.
as she approached.
Also,
Clipboard clutched like a
number
weapon.
go up.
Behind
I
her,
didn't
the two
even-
HOA
when it
security
went
guards
up, I
followed,
didn't even
cameras
feel
snapping
like
photos
good.
of the cabin, the porch furniture, even my truck.
Number go up.
"You have
Didn't
7 days to
feel
vacate this
that
property,"
good, but
Karen
when it
announced,
went down,
voice
I
sharp and
felt
cold.
bad.
HOA
So
records
it's
showed this
like,
cabin is in violation of our
there's no
regulations.
winning,
You've been
right?
living here illegally,
There's
and I'm
no
enforcing
upside
compliance
to
immediately.
this.
I blinked. 7
I didn't
days?
feel
Illegally?
satisfied
I opened my
when I
mouth,
got
but the words felt
better.
useless against her certainty. "I don't understand," I
just
said,
felt
trying to keep my voice
worse
steady.
when it
"This is
got
my family cabin.
worse.
My grandfather helped build
Like,
this
it's
community.
like, it's
I
just
own this land."
lose-lose.
Karen
So I
smiled,
just stopped
just slightly,
tracking it
but it
all.
carried a kind of smug satisfaction that made my skin crawl. Ownership is complicated.
It's kind of
HOA
the
oversight
same
trumps your
with
claims until proven otherwise. You're a resident under our management records. That makes you subject to eviction.
as well.
She handed me the eviction notice. The paper looked official, stamped with HOA
I mean,
letterhead,
don't get me
signatures
wrong,
and
I
dates.
like it when
guards
the
hovered,
number
watching
go
my
up.
reaction,
Number
phones
go up,
raised.
good,
It
but
felt like I was suddenly a criminal in my own home. I studied
when
the
it go
document
down,
carefully.
it
Something
feel
about it
bad.
didn't add up. The way the
Feel
rules were
bad.
cited, the references to bylaws, it
So
was
it's
vague,
better to
almost
just
generic,
detach
and suspiciously
myself
convenient.
from it.
A legal loophole, or worse, an intentional
It's
stretch.
nice Twitch are
"I've never been under your
promoting
management,"
me
I said, trying not
at
to
the
let anger
moment,
take over.
That's good. I'm
"This
on the
cabin has
front
been in my
page,
family
that's
for
really
decades.
cool.
You can't just evict me." Karen's eyes narrowed. "We have authority over all properties within the association.
I
Your
don't
claims
wanna
mean nothing
jump-
if they
I
conflict
don't
with
wanna
HOA oversight.
really
I suggest
don't
you
wanna
comply
let
before
it,
further action
like,
is necessary."
affect my mental
She turned to the
state.
guards.
It's
"Document everything.
so
We may
unhealthy.
need proof of non-compliance for the next board meeting." I felt a surge of disbelief and frustration. She had no idea who she was dealing with. For all her confidence, Karen was making
Just
assumptions,
enjoy
and
it,
assumptions
because
could be
at the end of
dangerous when the
day,
facts didn't line up.
sidetracking isn't
The
gonna
moment she
make
left,
things
I
better.
sank into the porch chair,
Exactly.
staring at the eviction notice. My heart was still
What is
racing,
it? What
but now a
does it
different feeling had
mean?
taken over: determination. This wasn't just about me. This was about my family legacy, the property my grandfather had worked so hard to protect. And I wasn't going to let someone with a fancy title and a
Trust
clipboard
me
take
to
it from me.
work on, alright, well,
I reached for my phone and called my attorney. If Karen thought she could bully her way through the HOA bylaws, she was about to discover that the law and the truth was on my side. Even from that first encounter, I knew this wouldn't be a quick fight, but it had begun. And when it ended, the people under her authority might finally see the reality of her overreach. The eviction notice sat on the kitchen table, staring back at me like a dare. I poured another cup of coffee and spread out the HOA paperwork. Each page seemed official, stamped and signed, but as I read, my stomach sank and then clenched. The citations, the references to bylaws, even the legal language, it didn't match anything I remembered from previous HOA agreements. Something was off. Very off. I started comparing the HOA's claims with my grandfather's old property files, land deeds, lease agreements, survey maps, pages yellowed with age, handwritten notes in the margins, signatures from decades ago. Slowly, the truth began to emerge. The HOA documents were either incomplete or deliberately misleading. Some references didn't exist, others had been altered in ways that gave Karen more authority than she actually had. It felt like a punch in the gut. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was an attempt to rewrite history, to ignore the fact that my family had owned and managed this property long before the HOA ever existed. And now, Karen was trying to use it as leverage to push me out. I didn't have much time. Karen's inspections started the very next day. She sent letters accusing me of new violations, parking, landscaping, even minor structural issues that were decades old and perfectly compliant. The guards returned several times, snapping photos of the cabin, documenting every move I made. Every notice raised the stakes. This wasn't just about eviction, it was about my family legacy, the land that had been in my name for generations, and my reputation in the community. Neighbors whispered when they saw the guards, some with concern, others with judgment. I had to act carefully. One wrong move, one misstep, and Karen could spin it into another violation to strengthen her case. I spent nights at the cabin, cross-referencing every page, making copies of old agreements, scanning maps, and storing digital backups. I made a list of anomalies in the HOA's claims bylaws that didn't match the official state records, discrepancies in property ownership, signatures that didn't line up. Each new discovery made my resolve stronger. Karen might have power and confidence, but she didn't have the facts. At the same time, I reached out to a few neighbors quietly. People I trusted, long-term residents who remembered the way the community was built, who had seen the original land transactions. Some were hesitant at first, fearing Karen's wrath. Others seemed relieved someone was finally challenging her overreach. A few even admitted they'd been confused by the HOA notices themselves, unsure if the fines and rules were legitimate. By the end of the week, the situation had escalated further. Another inspection notice arrived, demanding that I fix violations in the landscaping that were clearly subjective. Karen sent emails threatening higher fines if I didn't comply. Every message made it obvious she wasn't planning to negotiate or understand the facts. She wanted me gone. But in that escalation, she had also left traces evidence of overreach, mistakes in citing bylaws, and inconsistencies in her paperwork. Every threat, every inspection, every false accusation was a breadcrumb leading to the truth. I started documenting Karen's actions meticulously. Every email, every letter, every inspection report. I even noted times when the guards photographed areas of the property that had nothing to do with the alleged violations. All of it would be important later. For the first time, the fight became personal. This wasn't just about complying with HOA rules. This was about defending my family's legacy. I couldn't let Karen or anyone think they could rewrite decades of history with a few pieces of paper and a smug smile. And so I began planning. Quietly, strategically, I mapped out every step Karen had taken, identified weaknesses in her authority, and started assembling evidence that would prove she had no power over me. Every copy of a lease, every old map, every notarized document became a weapon in this battle. As I worked late into the nights, the cabin felt different. The calm of the mornings, the mist over the lake, the quiet rustle of the pines was now under siege. But it also reminded me what I was fighting for. Not just a house, not just a piece of land. My family's history, preserved through decades, could not be erased by someone who didn't understand it. The tension was rising. Karen was relentless, but I was methodical. She might have started this battle thinking she had the upper hand, but every inspection, every threat, and every fine she sent me only strengthened my position. By the time the weekend arrived, I had a binder stacked with evidence, a digital folder of scans, and a list of neighbors who could testify about the true history of the property. The stage was set. Karen had escalated, and I was ready to respond. This was no longer just a fight over a cabin. It was a fight to expose the truth, defend my legacy, and prove that arrogance without knowledge could be challenged and defeated. By the time Monday rolled around, Karen's presence felt unavoidable. She wasn't content with letters and inspections anymore. She had escalated. Roadblocks were suddenly placed along the gravel driveway leading to the cabin. Every morning, I'd arrive to find cones and warning signs, some claiming restricted HOA access or violation unauthorized entry. One of the guards even tried stopping me, asking for identification to enter my own property. At first, I was stunned. The audacity of it. Karen had somehow convinced herself that blocking access to the land I owned was legitimate. It was intimidation on a personal level, designed to make me feel powerless, but it had the opposite effect. Each time I bypassed the cones and calmly documented everything on my phone, I felt a flicker of resolve growing stronger. Then came the fines. Citations appeared in the mailbox, covering everything from improper landscaping to vehicle placement violations. Some were laughably vague. One listed my truck as non-compliant with HOA visual standards. Others claimed I had altered portions of the property without permission, even though nothing had changed in years. Neighbors started whispering when they saw the guards hovering outside. Some were curious, some nervous, and a few clearly took Karen's side. Rumors spread. He's defying the HOA. He doesn't pay attention to rules. Maybe she's right about the eviction. It stung to see people question me, even those who had known my family for decades. I couldn't let emotion take over. I contacted my attorney and began cataloging every interaction, every letter, every threat. Emails from Karen were archived. Fines were photographed. Security guard presence, inspection dates, and unusual demands were all logged. If Karen wanted a battle, she would have to face someone prepared with facts, not anger. In the process, I began noticing inconsistencies. Some of Karen's enforcement actions clearly violated HOA rules. Notices were delivered without proper procedure. Certain bylaws she cited didn't even exist in the original HOA charter. Other rules had been altered without board approval, which was required under state law. Slowly, it became clear. She wasn't just aggressive. She was illegally overreaching. One evening, after another round of citations arrived, I sat on the porch and went through them line by line. Every vague claim, every improperly cited rule, every procedural error built a pattern. Karen was testing boundaries, hoping I'd back down, hoping the intimidation would work. But the more I analyzed, the more I realized this could be used against her. Every false citation was proof of overreach. Every improper inspection, evidence of harassment. The following day, Karen came herself, flanked by the guards, clipboard in hand, demanding to inspect areas of the property she had never mentioned before. She prowled the deck, pointing at minor scratches on the wood, claiming they were code violations. I stayed calm, recording every word and every action. Her anger was palpable, but her confidence was starting to waver as she realized I wasn't intimidated. Neighbors peered from their decks and windows, whispering again. Some had grown curious, others suspicious. A few even waved at me, quietly showing solidarity. Karen, oblivious to the growing scrutiny, continued to push. It was during one of these confrontations that I discovered a critical piece of information. In a brief, careless comment, Karen mentioned an attempt to standardize property control across all parcels and update lease oversight. My mind raced. That was it. That statement revealed her true strategy. She wasn't just enforcing HOA rules, she was trying to take control of land that didn't belong to the HOA at all. She was attempting to expand her authority illegally, unknowingly stepping onto territory that was legally mine. I documented that comment immediately, knowing it could become pivotal evidence later. I also began tracing every amendment Karen had made to HOA documents since she became president. Some of her changes had never been approved properly by the board. Others conflicted directly with county property records. The more I dug, the clearer the pattern became. Karen was overstepping her authority in ways that could unravel her entire campaign against me. By the end of the week, the cabin felt like a battleground. Each day brought new inspections, fines, and emails. Each encounter with Karen and her guards was tense, calculated, and exhausting. Yet each day also provided me with evidence, documentation, and clarity. I began drafting a plan. I would not fight blindly. I would expose Karen's overreach systematically, using her own aggression against her. Every threat, every roadblock, every improper citation was now part of the strategy. I made a mental map of how this escalation would play out. Gather evidence, verify legal standing, consult neighbors and professionals, and prepare for a public confrontation that would leave no doubt about who truly held the authority. By Friday, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and cast long shadows over the cabin, I realized something important. Karen's attacks, meant to intimidate, had done the opposite. They had forced me to uncover the truth, gather allies, and understand the full scope of my rights. Her aggression had lit the spark for the next phase, and when the time came to confront her publicly, everything she thought she controlled would crumble. The morning after Karen's latest inspection, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. Her attacks had escalated to the point of absurdity, but now I saw the pattern clearly. If I was going to fight back, I needed allies and evidence, solid, undeniable proof. I started with neighbors I trusted. Longtime residents who had lived in the community for decades were surprisingly receptive. Over coffee and quiet conversations, they recalled the early days of the HOA, my grandfather's role in building the community, and how some of the land had been held under long-term ground leases. A few even showed me old letters and photographs documenting construction, ownership, and agreements with the HOA from decades ago. Their memories and records filled in gaps I hadn't even known existed. Next, I called in professional help. A licensed surveyor walked the property with me, measuring boundaries and reviewing historical plats. Every corner of the cabin, every parcel of land, was mapped and cross-checked against county records. I discovered what I had suspected, but had never seen so clearly. Karen's claims were built on assumptions and incomplete documentation. Some of the areas she had targeted as HOA jurisdiction were actually part of my grandfather's original lease agreements, legally binding and recorded. I brought the information to my attorney, a calm and experienced professional who listened intently as I explained the situation. If Karen truly doesn't realize this, my attorney said, then everything she's doing could be legally challenged. You have leverage, and you need to prepare for the public confrontation carefully. This is your moment to take control. The breakthrough came when we traced the historical land ownership documents back to the original agreements from the 1970s. Not only was the cabin legally mine, but Karen, without realizing it, had been enforcing rules on a property that technically belonged to me, under a ground lease structure my grandfather had set up. Every false citation, every roadblock, every inspection she had initiated was technically invalid. The implications were enormous. She had built her campaign against me on the foundation of ignorance, assuming authority where she had none. Every action she had taken now became evidence of overreach proof, that her arrogance and assumptions could be challenged and, ultimately, exposed. As we dug deeper, we also uncovered attempts to manipulate HOA bylaws and community agreements. Certain amendments Karen had pushed through were either improperly approved or never officially ratified. Others conflicted directly with county property records. It was clear she had been trying to rewrite the rules to strengthen her control, but her own ignorance had created a perfect trail for me to follow. I spent nights in the cabin poring over documents, digital copies, and historical records, cross-referencing every citation. Maps, letters, photographs, and notarized agreements stacked into a growing archive of evidence. Every page, every discrepancy, every improperly executed amendment became another tool for the battle ahead. At the same time, I continued rallying allies quietly. A few neighbors agreed to testify to the true history of the land. One former HOA board member provided insight into the proper procedures for amendments and inspections, confirming Karen's actions were out of line. Even longtime contractors who had worked on the cabin decades ago offered statements about ownership and maintenance, strengthening the historical record. With every piece of evidence, my confidence grew. The first time Karen had marched onto my porch, I had felt powerless. Now, I felt empowered. I had proof, witnesses, and expert testimony to back me up. The scales of authority were shifting. For the first time, I didn't just plan to defend my property. I planned to reclaim it in front of the community and make sure Karen's overreach was undeniable. By midweek, my binder of evidence was complete. Digital backups were stored in multiple secure locations. Maps were annotated, signatures verified, and bylaws compared with official state records. I could almost see the public confrontation unfolding in my mind. Karen would speak with confidence, but every claim she made could be countered with facts, history, and legality. I spent a long evening walking the property, taking mental stock of what we had uncovered. Every tree, every porch beam, every corner of the land held a story Karen had tried to overwrite with her authority and intimidation. But now, armed with facts and allies, I was ready to tell that story properly. As the sun set over the cabin, casting long shadows across the lake, I felt a calm I hadn't experienced since Karen first appeared on my property. The battle wasn't over, but the turning point had arrived. I knew what I had to do, and I had the evidence to make it undeniable. When the time came for the public confrontation, I would stand firm. Karen would realize, finally, that she had been challenging someone who knew the truth, documented it, and had the law, history, and community on their side. The arrogance that had fueled her aggression would crumble in the face of facts and preparation. And in that moment, I understood something deeper. This wasn't just about defending a cabin or a family legacy. It was about exposing overreach, standing up against arrogance, and proving that authority without knowledge could and would be challenged. The stage was set. The pieces were in place. Karen's confidence might still be high, but I was ready. The community, the evidence, and the law were all on my side. And when the confrontation finally came, the truth would finally be undeniable. The community hall was packed when I arrived. Folding chairs lined the room, neighbors whispering in small clusters, eyes darting toward the podium. Karen Whitmore stood front and center, clipboard in hand, flanked by a few board members who looked uncomfortable but hesitant to challenge her. The energy in the room was tense, charged like static before a storm. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. Every step toward the podium felt heavier than the last, but I reminded myself I had the facts, the history, and the law on my side. This wasn't just about me, it was about the truth, my family legacy, and the community's right to see justice done. Karen started first, her voice projecting authority. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, scanning the room with a practiced glare. We have a situation regarding one of the residents here. Mr. Protagonist's last name has been occupying a property in violation of HOA rules, and I am here to enforce compliance. Our records are clear. He has been warned repeatedly, yet refuses to adhere to regulations. A few neighbors nodded politely, some looking skeptical, others unsure. Karen leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if to make the accusation more personal. We cannot allow anyone to undermine the rules that protect our community. Allowing this behavior sets a dangerous precedent. I stayed quiet, letting her words hang in the air for a moment. Then, I cleared my throat. Excuse me, Karen, I said, stepping up. If I may, I have some information that clarifies the situation. She raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly. Oh, please enlighten us. I unrolled my maps and began speaking calmly, pointing to historic property boundaries. This cabin has been in my family for decades. My grandfather helped establish this land, and legal records, county documents, and signed lease agreements confirm ownership and proper occupancy. Karen's claims are based on incomplete HOA records, not the law, not property deeds, and certainly not the historical facts of this community. I held up copies of notarized documents, maps, and old photographs. These agreements are official, filed with the county decades ago. Every action Karen has taken, fines, inspections, threats, is unsupported by law and misrepresents her authority over this property. A murmur ran through the audience. Some neighbors exchanged glances, their skepticism growing. Karen's confident posture wavered just slightly, but she quickly masked it with a practiced smile. You can't just cherry-pick documents and claim authority over HOA rules, she shot back, voice rising. The board has the final say, and I am the president. Compliance is mandatory. I held up a hand. I'm not denying HOA regulations, Karen, but the property you're enforcing rules on is legally leased and owned by my family. You may have believed otherwise, but the law, the records, and history all prove otherwise. And everything you've done so far, roadblocks, citations, inspections, can be challenged legally. Some of the neighbors shifted in their seats, whispering quietly to one another. One older man raised his hand, hesitant at first. Wait, didn't she place cones blocking your driveway without notice? Yes, I said calmly, and without legal authority, which makes it a violation of my rights. Karen opened her mouth, clearly caught off guard. But before she could respond, I continued. I have consulted legal counsel. I have surveyed the property. And I have the historical documentation to show that this property has been correctly managed and that all HOA rules are being followed within my legal rights. The atmosphere in the room changed subtly. Murmurs became louder. Faces that had once looked skeptical now turned thoughtful. Karen's confident gaze began to flicker. She realized the tide was shifting and that the room might no longer be on her side. Karen took a step back, straightening her blazer, trying to regain control. You think maps and documents excuse ignoring community rules? She said sharply. Authority comes from the board, and your actions have undermined the HOA. I shook my head, remaining calm. Authority is important, yes, but authority doesn't override legal ownership or historical agreements. And as president, you have a responsibility to act within the law, not personal assumptions. A few neighbors cleared their throats. One woman stood, speaking up cautiously. I've lived here for 20 years, she said, and I remember when Mr. Protagonist's last name's grandfather established this land. Everything he's saying matches what I've seen. Another man added, some of these citations and inspections, they seemed unnecessary, maybe even exaggerated. Whispers spread through the room like wildfire. Karen's attempts at intimidation were faltering under the scrutiny of witnesses. She opened her mouth, but no words came out immediately, and the subtle confidence she carried for weeks was slipping. I laid out each piece of evidence methodically. Maps showing historical boundaries, notarized leases, county records confirming ownership, and photographs of the property untouched for decades. Each citation, each roadblock, and every inspection she ordered was based on incomplete or misinterpreted information, I explained. And because of that, every action can be legally questioned. A few neighbors nodded. Some whispered encouragement. Others looked at Karen with doubt. The room was shifting, support slowly leaving her and gathering around me. Karen attempted one last push, voice sharp. You can't just present documents and expect them to override the rules. The HOA has authority, and this is non-negotiable. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. I'm not negotiating. I'm showing the facts. Authority isn't absolute. It has to operate within legal and historical limits, and every action you've taken outside those limits is subject to review. For the first time, Karen's posture faltered completely. The confidence that had fueled every threat, every inspection, every citation was cracking. She glanced at the board members, hoping for support, but the room was quiet, tension thick. Neighbors who had initially sided with Karen now spoke up, confirming what I had presented. Some recounted personal knowledge of property history. Others challenged her actions during inspections. Every voice added weight to my side. By the time I concluded, the room had shifted entirely. Karen was no longer in control. The community was watching, listening, and questioning. Her arguments, once commanding, now rang hollow against documented facts, historical evidence, and community witness accounts. I stepped back, letting the room absorb what had just been presented. The whispers turned to nods, murmurs of agreement spreading. Karen stood there, stunned, realizing the tide had turned against her. For the first time, she was confronted not just by the law, but by the truth, witnesses, and the community she had tried to manipulate. The confrontation had reached its peak. I could feel the shift in energy. Karen's authority was crumbling. My case was solid, and the stage was set for the final showdown. The morning of the final HOA hearing felt heavier than any day before. I arrived at the community hall early, armed with binders, maps, notarized documents, emails, photographs, and testimony statements from neighbors and former board members. The room buzzed with quiet whispers as residents trickled in, curiosity and anticipation painting every face. Karen Whitmore was already there, standing tall in her usual authoritative stance, clipboard in hand, as if sheer confidence could bend the rules in her favor. The meeting began formally, the HOA president calling the session to order. Karen wasted no time, launching into her prepared speech. We are here to resolve an ongoing situation with Mr. Protagonist's last name, she said, voice sharp and rehearsed. Despite repeated warnings, inspections, and citations, he continues to defy the rules of this community. His occupancy is in direct violation of HOA regulations. and we must act to preserve fairness and compliance for all residents. I listened carefully, noting every overstatement and exaggeration. Her tone was calm, but her eyes betrayed impatience, almost irritation that the room was paying attention to the facts and not just her authority. When it was my turn, I stepped forward with measured confidence. "Thank you for allowing me to present the facts," I began. "This isn't just about rules or compliance. This is about property ownership, historical agreements, and respect for legal boundaries.
yeah,
The property in question
Thank
has been under my family's ownership and long-term lease for decades. My grandfather helped establish this community, and records confirm proper legal status for my occupancy." I laid out the evidence systematically. Maps showed the original boundaries of the cabin, verified by county surveys. Notarized lease agreements confirmed ownership rights, while photographs spanning decades documented consistent maintenance and occupancy. Emails from the HOA board, in some cases contradicting Karen's claims, were displayed to show procedural errors. Each document, each photograph, each sworn statement built the narrative that Karen had acted outside her authority. Karen interjected mid-presentation. "These documents don't supersede HOA authority," she said sharply, trying to regain control. "Rules are rules. Compliance is mandatory." I stayed calm. "Authority does not override legality," I replied. Every citation, inspection, and threat issued by Karen Whitmore was based on incomplete or inaccurate information. Historical records, county filings, and HOA procedural requirements confirm that her actions are invalid. Furthermore, evidence shows attempts to manipulate bylaws without proper approval, which constitutes overreach. Whispers ran through the audience. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some avoiding eye contact with Karen. One longtime resident stood, recalling personal memories of my grandfather establishing the property and explaining how Karen's recent actions contradicted historical practices. Karen's confidence began to crack. She tried to rally support, but each point she made was countered with clear documentation. Another neighbor raised their hand and challenged a recent fine, explaining it had no legal standing. Slowly, the room shifted. Whispers of doubt grew into open questioning. Karen's voice grew defensive, her words harsher, her posture rigid. She realized the authority she had wielded so freely was slipping through her fingers. I continued presenting evidence, pointing out specific discrepancies, citations citing non-existent bylaws, inspections conducted without proper notice, and procedural errors in enforcing rules. Each example revealed a pattern of overreach, incompetence, and manipulation. The murmurs turned to nods. The community was witnessing the unraveling of her claims in real time. By the end of the first hour, Karen's strategy was collapsing. Every threat she had made, every inspection she had conducted, and every citation she had issued could now be challenged legally. Residents and board members, seeing the weight of facts and evidence, began questioning her credibility. Her usual smirk and confident tone were gone, replaced by tension and frustration. I stepped back, letting the evidence speak for itself. The community had heard the story from all sides, the historical truth, the legal documentation, and the personal testimony. Karen had projected authority for weeks, but in this room, authority alone wasn't enough. Truth, backed by evidence, was stronger. Karen's face flushed as she attempted a final defense. "You're interpreting documents selectively. You're twisting facts," she shouted. "The HOA has the right to govern properties under its jurisdiction, and this residence is within that authority." I remained calm, meeting her gaze. "I am not twisting facts. The facts, the law, and the historical record all support my case. Authority cannot exist without legitimacy. Your actions, roadblocks, fines, inspections, and threats were carried out beyond your legal authority. Each is now documented and verifiable. Every action is invalid under the law." A former HOA board member stood and spoke up. "I reviewed these actions and bylaws. The procedures Karen followed were inconsistent with HOA policies. Some changes were never approved by the board. Others conflict with historical property records. The enforcement over Mr. Protagonist's last name. Cabin is unsupported by proper legal or procedural foundation." More neighbors chimed in. Long-term residents testified to the historical ownership and proper management of the property. Contractors corroborated decades of maintenance under the family's care. The room buzzed with realization. Karen had acted outside her authority. Karen's voice faltered. She looked around, seeking validation from the board, but the hesitant glances told her everything she needed to know. The tide had turned. Residents who had once been silent now questioned her actions openly. The overconfidence and arrogance she had displayed for weeks crumbled under the weight of collective scrutiny. I summarized the evidence one last time: maps showing legal boundaries, notarized documents confirming family ownership, county filings, and HOA procedural errors. The facts are clear, I said. Authority must respect legality. Personal ambition cannot override historical and legal truth. This property has been properly owned and maintained under all relevant agreements. Karen's attempts to assert otherwise are invalid and unenforceable. A heavy silence filled the room as the board and residents digested the information. Then, one by one, members began to voice agreement. Nods, murmurs, and affirmations spread through the audience. Karen, for the first time, was alone in her argument. Authority without evidence was powerless. The chairman of the HOA finally spoke. Given the evidence presented, the documentation, and the testimony from community members, it is clear that enforcement actions taken against Mr. Protagonist's last name were conducted beyond the legal authority of the HOA president. All citations, fines, and inspections issued under these claims are null and void. The room erupted into murmurs of approval. Relief and satisfaction washed over me. Karen's face turned pale. She opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing there was no rebuttal, no path to salvage credibility. Her overreach had been publicly exposed, and the community saw the truth. I felt a surge of emotion relief, vindication, and pride. Every night spent researching, documenting, and consulting allies had led to this moment. Not only had I protected my family cabin, but I had also restored the integrity of the community process. Authority must be accountable, and in this case, justice had prevailed. Neighbors came forward, shaking my hand, offering congratulations and expressing gratitude. Some apologized for doubting me. Others acknowledged that Karen's actions had created unnecessary tension and fear. I realized that the victory wasn't just personal. It was a victory for everyone who valued fairness, transparency, and truth. Karen gathered her belongings silently and left, her usual confidence gone. The room settled into a quiet realization. The HOA president could no longer intimidate or overreach without consequence. The law, facts, and community had spoken louder than arrogance. As I stepped outside into the warm afternoon sun, I took a deep breath, surveying the cabin, the driveway, and the familiar surroundings. My family legacy was intact. My home was secure, and the message was clear. Authority cannot replace integrity, and truth, when documented and defended, will always prevail. The days after the hearing felt surreal. The tension that had gripped the community for weeks slowly dissipated, replaced by a cautious calm. Karen Whitmore's authority had been publicly questioned, and the HOA board acted quickly to restore trust. Meetings were held to clarify proper procedures, and reforms were implemented to prevent unilateral overreach in the future. Several board members who had enabled her actions were reprimanded, and Karen herself was removed from her position as president, her power dismantled by the evidence and community support she had once dismissed. Walking through the cabin that morning, sunlight streaming through the pines, I felt a sense of relief I hadn't known in weeks. The driveway was clear. The cones, the warning signs, the guards all gone. The space felt like it had been returned to its rightful state, just as it should have been. Every creak of the porch boards, every scent of the pine forest felt familiar again. But now it carried a new weight: victory, justice, and the quiet satisfaction of standing firm. Neighbors began approaching more openly. Some apologized for doubting me, expressing regret for initially siding with Karen or staying silent. Others shared stories of similar disputes in the past, thanking me for showing that standing up against overreach was possible. It wasn't just my victory. It was a victory for the community, a restoration of integrity and accountability. Even the children who played nearby seemed to sense the calm returning. The air felt lighter, more secure. People were no longer glancing nervously at the property or wondering if the next HOA inspection would turn personal. Stability, long absent, was slowly returning. I reflected on the weeks of escalation, the
Otherwise, I'll
confrontation,
just
and
have
the
to
evidence
wait
I
till I
had
get
painstakingly
home. But at
gathered.
least I've got
I realized that this
thing
battle had
now.
changed me. The fear and
I
frustration
can
that
do
had
it
gripped me in the
properly
early
at
days had been
home if it
replaced by
doesn't,
empowerment,
if I can't
confidence,
do it
and clarity.
today.
I had learned to navigate authority, to document truth, and to stand firm even when the odds seemed
Hopefully it's
stacked.
not gonna
It wasn't
rain
just about my
today,
cabin anymore.
but I will
It was about
need it for
ensuring that the law and
tomorrow,
community
'cause it's
agreements were
supposed to rain
respected, that
tomorrow
authority was
and
accountable,
Friday,
and that no one could
so
intimidate residents with assumptions or overconfidence. I felt a renewed connection to the land my grandfather had loved, a responsibility not just to preserve it, but to protect it. I began reaching out to neighbors, sharing guidance on property rights, HOA bylaws, and how to respond to overreach. The conversations were encouraging. People were listening, asking questions, and gaining confidence. I realized that one person taking a stand could ripple outward, creating awareness and empowerment that reached far beyond my own property. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to enjoy the cabin fully. Sitting on the porch, watching sunlight shimmer on the lake, I felt a deep, emotional satisfaction. The legal battle had ended. Karen's overreach had been exposed, and the community was slowly returning to equilibrium. I could finally breathe. As the weeks passed, the cabin became more than just a home. It became a symbol of resilience, legacy, and perseverance. Each morning, I walked along the familiar trails,
I
noting the
definitely
wildflowers and the
need it.
reflections of sunlight on the water. The quiet calm of nature reminded me of why this battle had mattered, not just for legality, but for emotional connection and family heritage. I thought
Was that
often
the
about my
bike shop
grandfather
that's
and the
moved?
care he had taken in
No, that
establishing
was
this
in
land.
Peckham.
He had worked tirelessly to protect the property, ensure
That was
proper
in
agreements,
Peckham
and maintain
yesterday.
integrity within the community. Standing where I stood now, I felt a profound sense of responsibility to continue that legacy.
That was
Defending the cabin had been more than a
Condor's
personal
been there
fight.
for
It had been an act of
years
honoring the
and
generations
years
who
and
had built
years.
this land with
Very
patience and care.
well
Neighbors began
known
reconnecting in a way that
central
hadn't happened
London
during the
bike
weeks of
shop.
tension. Conversations became collaborative rather than cautious. People shared advice, checked in on each other, and expressed gratitude for the transparency and accountability that had been restored. It was as if the cabin had become a focal point for rebuilding trust and community cohesion.
I'm gonna wait
I
for
reflected on the
light.
personal growth I had undergone. The fear and frustration I had experienced early in the confrontation had been replaced by patience, strategy, and assertiveness. I had learned to document meticulously, to rely on both legal expertise and historical knowledge, and to communicate calmly in the face of aggression. The process had sharpened my judgment and reinforced my confidence in standing up for what was right. Even simple tasks around the cabin felt different now. Fixing a fence, clearing leaves, or tending the garden carried an added significance. Each action was a reaffirmation of ownership, stability, and the triumph of truth over intimidation. The cabin itself seemed to
I
breathe
don't know why
again,
I'm
no longer under
walking
threat,
right
but
now.
restored to the place of peace it had always been meant to be. I also reflected on the broader lessons for the community.
Should've just
Karen's
got back
removal
on
had
the
sent a
bike,
clear
to be
message.
honest.
Authority must be exercised responsibly, and the residents have a voice. The bylaws and procedures had been clarified, and checks put in place to prevent similar
No idea
overreach.
why I'm
People began
walking.
asking questions, engaging more actively, and understanding their rights. The outcome had ripple effects beyond my
Peckham
property.
for money
It restored
for
accountability and
horses.
empowerment for everyone in the neighborhood. Emotionally, I felt a deep sense of closure. The anxiety, tension, and uncertainty of the previous weeks had been replaced by pride and relief. I had defended my family legacy, preserved a home that carried decades of history, and protected the community from unchecked
Buy
authority.
bikes
Every
on
challenge, every late night
everyone's
spent
the
reviewing
tough
documents,
one.
every
You gonna
difficult
buy a
conversation
bike
had led to
over?
this moment of clarity and satisfaction. Sitting on the porch one
I
evening,
would
watching the sunset over the
recommend,
lake, I felt gratitude. Gratitude for the evidence that proved the truth, for the neighbors who had supported me, and for the strength I discovered within myself.
honestly,
The cabin had survived. My family
honestly,
legacy was
I
secure,
would just
and the
buy a
community was stronger for
frame
it. This
and
experience
go
taught me
to
that
a
standing up for
local
what's right
bike
isn't
shop
easy,
and just
but it
ask
is
them to
essential.
build the
Authority
bike
without
up for you.
accountability can be challenged. Legacy without
With
defense can be threatened, but
with
resilience, preparation, and truth can overcome
components.
intimidation and manipulation. I had learned to
It's gonna
navigate
be
both legal and
cheaper.
emotional landscapes,
But it
and in
depends
doing
what
so,
your
I had
budget
grown
is
in ways I
always,
hadn't anticipated. The cabin was
really
once again a
depends what
sanctuary,
your
a place
budget
of peace and history, but it was also a symbol of empowerment. I knew that, moving forward, I would continue to protect it,
It's
educate
like when you
others,
build
and
a
ensure that fairness
PC,
and legality
right?
remained the
I
cornerstones
should
of our
really
community.
get back on
The
the
battle was
road
over,
here.
but the lessons would last a
I have
lifetime.
to cross
The
it
sun had
over.
begun to dip behind the distant mountains, painting the cabin and surrounding forest in golden light. I sat on the porch, the familiar creak of the boards beneath me grounding my thoughts. For weeks, months even, this cabin had been more than a home. It had been a battlefield. And now, finally, it felt like a sanctuary again. The air was calm, the driveway clear, and the sound of birdsong replaced the tense murmur of disputes and confrontation. As I watched the shadows stretch across the lake, I reflected on what had happened. Karen Whitmore's aggression, the fines, the inspections, the roadblocks, all of it had been daunting, intimidating, and exhausting. But in the end, I realized something fundamental. Knowledge is power. Understanding property rights, studying the HOA rules, knowing the historical and legal context of your own land, these were not abstract lessons. They were tools of defense, instruments that allowed me to stand firm against arrogance and overreach. I thought about the preparation, the late nights going through documents, maps, emails, and photographs. Every detail mattered. Every witness, every notarized lease, every survey played a part. Patience had been critical. Reacting emotionally would have only clouded judgment. But by calmly gathering facts, consulting experts, and documenting everything meticulously, I had built a shield that no intimidation could pierce. More than that, I realized that standing up wasn't just about defending property. It was about protecting legacy. This cabin wasn't mine alone. It belonged to generations that had come before me. The stakes weren't just legal or financial, they were personal, emotional, and historical. Preserving the land meant honoring the sacrifices, care, and vision of my family. That awareness strengthened my resolve through the toughest moments of conflict. Looking around, I noticed the subtle changes in the community as well. Neighbors smiled with a sense of reassurance. Children played along the paths without the tension that had hung over the property for weeks. People were reconnecting. Conversations carried more empathy, and trust was being rebuilt. The battle hadn't just preserved the cabin, it had reminded the community of the importance of fairness, accountability, and standing up when something is wrong. And yet, the greatest lesson for me was personal. I had learned that authority, no matter how confident, can be challenged with facts, preparation, and courage. Intimidation, threats, and false assertions might feel powerful at first, but they crumble in the face of truth and persistence. Arrogance might scare some people into submission, but it cannot withstand patience and knowledge. This realization felt empowering and understanding that would guide me far beyond this cabin, far beyond HOA disputes, into other areas of life where integrity and persistence matter. I thought about the moments when doubt crept in, the nights when I worried that the opposition might succeed, the fear that community support might falter. But each time, the evidence I had gathered, the allies I had found, and the clarity of my purpose reminded me why it was worth standing firm. That combination of preparation, patience, and courage had turned a near impossible situation into a decisive victory. Now, as I watched the sun shimmer on the surface of the lake, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. The cabin, the family legacy, and the property rights I had fought for were secure. The HOA had reformed, the overreach had been addressed, and the community was beginning to heal. And I had emerged not only victorious but stronger, more confident, and wiser from the ordeal. To anyone watching this story, here's what I want you to take away. Never underestimate the importance of knowing your rights. Never let intimidation or false authority push you into submission. Research, document, consult experts, and rely on facts. Patience, strategy, and courage are more powerful than fear or aggression. And most importantly, remember that standing up for what's right is not just a personal victory, it can inspire and protect others in your community. If you've ever faced overreach, unfair treatment, or intimidation from an HOA or any authority, don't stay silent. Document everything. Seek allies. Protect your property and your rights. Share your experiences in the comments below, because your story could help someone else who feels powerless. And if you want to see more stories like this, stories about fighting unfairness, standing firm, and reclaiming control, subscribe and follow along. There's much more to learn, and each story is proof that preparation and persistence pay off. The cabin behind me was calm. The forest whispered softly in the breeze.
Well,
The water
kinda
reflected the
strange
fading
if you
sunlight like a
like.
mirror,
Actually,
perfectly
I'm quite
still,
interested
and for the
to
first
hear
time
what
in
you
months,
want.
I felt fully at peace. My family legacy
What
was
do you
intact.
want?
My home was
Call
safe.
it?
The battle had been won, not only through law and
What kind
documentation,
of
but through
stream
determination,
what
preparation,
would
and
be your
integrity. I leaned back,
perfect?
breathing in the
What
fresh mountain air,
is your
watching the last
idea
golden
of
rays
the
of light touch the
perfect
treetops.
stream?
The community around me was quiet but alive,
Huh?
a testament to resilience and justice. This was the
Young
kind of calm that
girl,
comes only after
please
struggle, the
answer
kind that
my
makes every moment of effort,
question.
every late night, every confrontation worth it.
Random
And as the
first
sun set
time
completely behind the
chatter.
mountains, I smiled, knowing the lesson I had learned would stay with me forever. Courage, facts, and patience will always outlast arrogance.